Hello, this is Jon Oltsik. I'm a Senior Principal Analyst at the Enterprise Strategy Group, and welcome to today's webinar, Operationalizing Threat Intelligence. And I'm joined by the VP of Products at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions, A.J. Shipley. Hello, A.J.
Hello, Jon. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Great to have you, and I know you're passionate about this subject as I am, so I think it'll make for a lively discussion. So when we talk about operationalizing threat intelligence, there's certainly been a lot of activity in threat intelligence world over the last few years. We've seen the U.S. federal government pushing for more threat intelligence sharing. We've seen a lot of innovation in threat intelligence, but we still are at this kind of crucial point on learning how to operationalize threat intelligence, and that's what we'll talk about today. Now, in support of that, I'm going to present some ESG research on threat intelligence, where ESG, my company, went out and interviewed 304 information security professionals working at enterprise organizations, and enterprise being defined as organizations with 1,000 employees or more. And so for starters, we asked those respondents to define their organization's top objectives for threat intelligence. And what we learned was 38%, so the highest percentage, said that their top objective was to improve automated incident prevention. So this is the ability to gather threat intelligence, understand what's going on in the wild, and then respond by fine-tuning security controls. Makes sense? You can block things more proactively. The number 2 response was to use threat intelligence to automate security operations and remediation activities. So that was 1/3 or 33%. Now, automation is key because we certainly don't have enough cybersecurity professionals to be able to do all of the things, all of the tasks, all the processes that they need to do, and in this case, work in concert with IT operations. So automation to streamline operations makes a lot of sense. And then 28% said they wanted to use threat intelligence, or their threat intelligence objective was to establish a central threat intelligence service to help guide the cybersecurity activities of smaller units within the organization. Now, that's related to the fact that threat intelligence historically was bought and consumed by lots of different individuals or groups within organizations. And as a threat intelligence consumer, I may not even know that my colleague, someone like AJ, is actually acquiring and consuming either the same or similar threat intelligence. So people are trying to create a centralized threat intelligence service that makes a lot of sense. Now, threat intelligence, as I mentioned, is very, very topical, but it's important to note where we are in this progression. So in this case, we asked these respondents for approximately how long has your organization's threat intelligence program been in place. What I'd like you to do is pay attention to the blue and the yellow pieces of the pie. So the blue piece, there were 12% who said that their threat intelligence program had been in place about 1 year. And then another 28% in yellow said more than 1 year but less than 2 years. So that's 40% in total. And let's be honest, let's interpret that data as it states. That's an immature part of the market. So 2 years of consuming, processing, analyzing, and operationalizing threat intelligence is not a lot of time. And so in that sense, there are technology issues, there are operational issues, and people who want to operationalize threat intelligence to get more out of it, to get better ROI, really need some guidance. And I know AJ has lived in this world, and I think his part of this webinar will be particularly insightful to those people. Now, with immaturity of threat intelligence, it's no surprise that there are numerous challenges. And I won't go through all of this data, but let me highlight a few things. So the question posed to the survey respondents was, which of the following challenges has your organization experienced with regard to collecting and analyzing external threat intelligence? So the largest percent, almost a third, 32%, said my organization has inadvertently blocked legitimate traffic as a result of a problem with threat intelligence collection and/or analysis. Now, anyone associated with security, anyone associated with IT knows this is a huge problem. Is if you are doing anything to disrupt business operations, that will be frowned upon because it's costing the organization real money. Now, unfortunately, the biggest problem that people identified with threat intelligence was just that. It was false positives related to analysis or collection. And so accuracy is tremendously important here, especially to operationalize threat intelligence. 32%, so the exact same amount, 32% said that their challenge was that threat intelligence is collected and analyzed by different individuals and tools, so it is difficult to get a holistic picture of internal and external threats. Now, this is important too. Almost a third of people said that there were these kinds of process problems. As I mentioned before, different individuals, different groups collecting their own little threat intelligence on web threats or DNS types of threats or IOCs or what have you, but they're not putting together a collective picture. And so blending that all in to something like a threat intelligence platform where we can understand the external threats and relate them to our internal vulnerabilities is really important in the threat intelligence program. 31% of those we surveyed said threat intelligence collection and analysis workflow process and integration problems. They defined that as their challenge. So once again, we're in the process and workflow area. This is taking raw intelligence and turning it into actionable processes within the organization. Those typically span against across security and IT operations. So there may be a lack of standards here for normalizing the data. We may have trouble with our data management layer and inserting and analyzing that data, or it may just be organizational problems across groups. So one other thing here, so 28% of organizations said that they were challenged because threat intelligence isn't always as timely or actionable as we need it to be. Now, I'm highlighting that because this is the name of the game here. This is what the most important thing is. Threat intelligence has a very finite shelf life. So if the bad guys are doing something today or this minute, I can only react to that in a certain time frame before they go ahead and make changes. And they're making changes very frequently to avoid detection. So if it's not timely or actionable, it's really sort of useless, and that's a really important issue when we talk about operationalizing threat intelligence. So another thing that we've seen is threat intelligence quality issues. So in this case, we asked individuals to tell us if it's how difficult it was to determine the quality and efficacy of threat intelligence. And what you see again in blue is 26% of those we surveyed said it is extremely difficult to determine the quality and efficacy of each individual threat intelligence feed. And another 48% said it's somewhat difficult to determine the quality and efficacy. So what do I mean by quality and efficacy? I mean the timeliness of threat intelligence, the details associated with threat intelligence, maybe going from IOCs to actual threat campaigns or cyber attack or behavior. Understanding threat intelligence as it relates to my organization and my industry. So I'm probably buying lots and lots of threat intelligence, but I have no idea which is good, which is bad, which is redundant with everything else. And so, you kind of have this this attitude in the market of more is better because maybe the second threat intelligence feed, or more likely the 10th, is giving me 1% incremental information, but that 1% is important. So basically we're guessing, and that's not good because we're spending money on guessing. Now, in spite of the problems that I talk about here, we are bullish on threat intelligence. And I mean we as we in the professional, the cybersecurity professional community, organizations, and I'll put myself in that category. Used effectively, threat intelligence is a key input into a much more effective cybersecurity program. And so there's a bullishness here where 27% of organizations say that their spending, that their organization's spending on threat intelligence program will increase significantly in the next 12 to 18 months. And then another 45% say that their spending will increase somewhat. So 72% of organizations will spend more on threat intelligence. Well, when you spend more, you want to get more. And really, that's what AJ and I will talk about in the second half of this. There's definitely consumption value and sharing potential for threat intelligence. The question is, how do we operationalize it more effectively? So that brings us to this nebulous term. What does the term operationalizing threat intelligence even mean? I can tell you that as I did this research, that term came up time and time again. So I dug in with people when they said, Jon, we need to operationalize our threat intelligence more effectively. I took the time and asked them, well, please tell me what you mean so that I can understand it. So here's a couple of things, and then we'll get into our discussion with AJ. But, whoops. So first of all, we've got to better understand our threat intelligence sources. And I go back to my quality metrics. We need the best fit for our organization. It has to be timely, it has to be actionable, and it has to be customized to my organization, my industry. And as important as that is today, as we get into IoT type application, it becomes even more important because it's very specialized. We need quality metrics. So we need to be able to manage threat intelligence, not just consume it. We need to understand if it's complete. We need to understand how to share it. We need to track this throughout the process. We need threat intelligence inputs and outputs. So this is the data management layer. This is collection and processing and analysis. But it's also outputs for remediation, outputs for workflow in that transition from security to IT operations. So we need to think about who does what at what time and how we track that whole process with threat intelligence. And finally, we need a threat intelligence sharing plan. So what we noticed with our research was that threat intelligence consumption, as immature as it is today, is far out ahead of threat intelligence sharing in any kind of an automated way. So we need to know and define what we want to share and how we're going to share this in a timely manner with partners that we want to share it with on an ad hoc basis. And we need legal to be able to buy in so that we're not sharing sensitive or regulated data, and we feel like we're protected as we share things. Finally, we need success metrics. So this means dashboarding things so that we can track how we're doing and make improvements. So when you're operationalizing threat intelligence, you need to ask yourself a number of questions, and this is where I'm going to bring AJ into the discussion. So how can threat intelligence do all of these things? And AJ, let's handle them one by one. So for instance, how can threat intelligence support incident response, which is, obviously a very key part of what we're trying to do here?
Yeah, so thanks, Jon, for that setup. And first of all, let me start off by saying, just based on my perspective of talking to various customers and prospects and industry analysts, I wholeheartedly agree with obviously all of the findings of your research. No surprise. I think specifically as we drill into some of these different workflows, if you will, or use cases, there's a number of different areas where threat intelligence can augment the overall security posture of an organization. And I think you touched on this in one of your slides, that threat intelligence can't be treated in isolation. It really needs to be viewed as a modifier or as a way of augmenting existing security controls, to include not only integrating into the existing workflows, but also to include integrating into the existing security infrastructure. And we'll talk about that in some subsequent questions here. But if we think specifically about the incident response process, right, and I think this is still where the majority of the industry is struggling, right now is that they continue to be very reactive, right? And the goal is to minimize the time from breach to detection, in order to minimize the exfiltration of intellectual property or other types of assets. One of the ways that, specifically LookingGlass believes that threat intelligence can help support the incident response process, and we have some products that do this very specifically, is by being able to correlate internal, if you will, east-west network traffic, for lack of a better term, with global threat intelligence, or ultimately, what the source or destination of that east-west traffic that's moving laterally across an organization and ultimately results in some type of north-south communication outside of the organization, in the case of an incident or a breach, being able to do that correlation between a very large data set that security practitioners, including myself, have had access to for a number of years, in the form of stuff like NetFlow. And I think folks are really starting to come around to just, the incredible power that NetFlow on their internal network can provide, but that NetFlow, when looking at NetFlow and when looking at your NetFlow collectors and your logs, without the threat intelligence to provide context to the locations out on the global internet where your traffic is ultimately, destined for, or where the source of those communications, whether they be from a C2 server or some other, malicious actor, where those are originating from, it's very hard to make sense of NetFlow. So what do I mean by that, right? I have, my internal assets, my 192, 168s, my 10 dots, my 172s, that are all communicating with each other, right? And I can go through logs and I can see that, they may be going out to a location on the internet. Maybe it's an 8 dot something, hosted on a well-known ISP, or maybe it's a 154 address. But by being able to bring in threat intelligence into that incident response process, we can very quickly see, and this goes to another point of yours, right, that we may have multiple sources telling us that 154 address out on the global internet has been, tagged by 3 or 4 different, threat intelligence providers, LookingGlass and maybe iSight and maybe an Emerging Threats Pro, as observed hosting malware, right, or as being a Tor node, for example. And by being able to augment that internal network telemetry that incident response practitioners almost immediately go to whenever they have a breach and they're trying to investigate the severity of that breach, with threat intelligence out on the global internet, and being able to provide that correlation both using historical indicators of compromise as well as real-time indicators of compromise, it gives the incident response practitioner almost instantaneous or immediate visibility into not only the number of transactions that have occurred and the amount of traffic that has gone back and forth between their internal hosts and those locations out on the internet, but it gives them immediate visibility into where those locations may be, whether they're known bad neighborhoods on the internet, part of bulletproof hosting services, or whether they, have multiple indicators of compromise on them from multiple sources, giving them a level of insight into the overall severity of the amount of data that's gone to those locations, as well as a place to start when, both investigating or working with local law enforcement, as well as a place to start in terms of trying to claw back some of that data. So that is, I think, an example of where global threat intelligence, as well as internet intelligence, being able to be correlated with local internal traffic specific to an organization, provides that relevancy that you talked about. And again, the fact that we can run these reports daily or by the minute, or really at the practitioner's desire. So we have a number of customers that come in and they run a report every single day, taking their internal NetFlow traffic and correlating it with real-time indicators of compromise. They are able to almost immediately see if there is any abnormal activity occurring on their network, going out to a known bad location, make a determination about what they know or don't know about that known bad location, and in many cases be able to shut down any future flows to those locations by integrating with other parts of their security infrastructure, which we'll talk about in a subsequent question.
Yeah, AJ, let me add that what I think the beauty of, or one of the benefits of what you just talked about was if you can do this effectively, you're empowering your junior analysts, and you're letting your junior analysts, you're giving them the tools to triage some of the maybe anomalous activity or even compromises that are occurring on your network without always escalating these things. So you're getting more productivity out of your organization.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point, and thank you for making it. Not only more productivity, but also decreasing the time, if you will, which is also another productivity enhancement. There's not as much of a cost in terms of time spent trying to do this investigation or even trying to detect a breach. So fantastic point.
Well, thank you. So the second question. Whoops, I think let's go back. So, so how can we address third-party risk and supply chain management? Now, given what we've seen in with the target breach and the OPM breach, where these breaches were really conducted through a series of steps that began with third parties or people in my supply chain, this is a really important point that it goes beyond my network. So, AJ, how do we handle that?
Yeah, so you call out, two well-known ones in the target breach, and everybody who's listening to this, I'm sure is familiar that breach occurred, by coming in through, an HVAC vendor that Target was using and compromising some credentials, and then being able to use, move laterally, if you will, through the supply chain. There's a couple of things that threat intelligence, allows users of threat intelligence to do. Right? It's not only monitor their own organization for all of the threats that are targeting their organization, but it gives them the ability to monitor other organizations because, again, threat intelligence predominantly revolves around this outside-in view, i.e., what is your public-facing infrastructure advertising to the rest of the world that bad guys are able to use to exploit in order to ultimately get access to your infrastructure. And so because that's what threat intelligence revolves around, we're also able to use that outside-in perspective to not only look at the organization that we care about, but also to look at the other organizations that are adjacent, that may be in their supply chain, that may be upstream or downstream of them from a vendor perspective, as well as being able to access all of the open source intelligence that we have, right? So, we have a couple of different technologies that we talk about internally. One is, and I mentioned it, briefly before, internet intelligence. Right? I can, with just a couple mouse clicks and keystrokes, I can immediately determine what LookingGlass or really anybody's public-facing network infrastructure looks like, i.e., what are all of the IP addresses and domains that I'm advertising that bad guys are going to use. And I can also go and look at one of my supply chain partners. And I can start to carve up the internet, if you will, and then start to correlate all of these other indicators of compromise that I have. So while my organization may not be being targeted, I can immediately determine if another organization that I do business with is being targeted. Depending on my level of relationship with them, I can give them an alert, just a courtesy alert, or I can also flag it as potentially an organization that is risky to do business with, and you can go through all of those steps as well. Similarly, another platform that we have that allows us to monitor essentially all of the open source things that are being said and all of the open source locations that are used to communicate, right? And this can be things, being used to communicate brand. This is, your typical surface web. This is your deep and dark web. The fact of the matter is that bad guys who are conducting operations or waging campaigns against organizations, the guys who are sitting behind keyboards use forums, use largely open source forums, whether it's very well known ones like Twitter or other ones, or they use deep and dark web forums. And I'll spend just a minute kind of defining those two terms, right? At LookingGlass, we define the deep web as basically the rest of the internet that you can get access to without requiring any type of special software, but you can't just browse to it by putting an address, or by clicking on a link. You have to know specifically where that location on the deep web is. And then again, the dark web is all of those locations that require special software in order to access. So think of Tor bundles. The surface web, the deep web, and the dark web, where these bad guys are essentially talking about the campaigns that they're using, and talking about how they are going to target a specific organization, all gets correlated and can be essentially bubbled up to my company. And once I've determined who I do business with, I can immediately start monitoring not only the people who are targeting me, but I can start monitoring the people who are targeting all of the organizations that I do business with, or all of the organizations that I'm dependent upon, because I'm both able to see the public-facing infrastructure that they advertise, as well as monitor all of the terms that I may need to monitor that indicates that somebody is talking about them, or indicates that somebody is going to potentially target them as a way to come and target me. So in both of these cases, threat intelligence and this outside-in perspective of threat intelligence that gives us visibility into really kind of the entire public infrastructure and the entire public business structure, if you will, that is interoperating on the global stage today, gives us the ability to monitor supply chains and monitor third parties and really get out in front of potentially any threats that are maybe not targeting me, but maybe targeting somebody who I'm doing business with, or maybe targeting somebody in the same industry that I'm in, which stands to reason that they may be targeting me next.
Yeah, and what I like about it is a lot of third-party relationships are governed by checkboxes. So I'm going to do business with you. You're my supplier. I send you a security checkbox. You send it to me, and once you send it to me, of course, it's no longer valid because everything's changing. So this really does give us a real-time method to manage those relationships that we really haven't done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think compliance is sometimes an overlooked aspect of this here, right? But the fact of the matter is, many organizations have a responsibility, right, to exercise due diligence and due care in terms of protecting their assets or protecting their clients' assets. And to your point, I think threat intelligence in and of itself and that additional visibility is a way to also address some of those compliance issues and make sure that organizations are exercising as much due care as possible in the protection of their digital assets or in the protection of their customers' information.
Exactly. So on to the next question. How can threat intelligence protect me or protect my organization from unauthorized access to digital assets? And I would point out that unauthorized access changes all the time because we're very fluid on who has access and who doesn't. And B, right now and into the future, unauthorized access may not be a person or a PC. It may be some type of IoT device. So how do we deal with that?
Yes, so both of those are fantastic points. What I would call out specifically is, and we are not in LookingGlass is not in the business of access control. And one of the things that you touched on there, I think, falls squarely in the camp of access control. And absolutely, we have a responsibility to integrate with existing access control solutions. And there are ways that threat intelligence can help augment that. But what I want to talk about specifically is, and this goes back to this statement that I made earlier about, monitoring open source forums or really open source, i.e. surface web, deep and dark web forums for things that people are saying or, quite frankly, things that people are trading. One of the things that we have seen just a exponential explosion or increase in the last year is the number of breach packages that are being essentially exchanged in various underground and dark web forums. Just to give you a sense, both of these graphics that you're seeing here, the top graphic is a scatter plot. The number of breach packages that our internal threat analyst team, our internal threat researchers have been able to curate from their access to various closed-door forums. And each dot represents a breach package, and the Y scale on the left-hand side of where that dot falls represents the total number of username and password combinations that happen to be in that breach package. Now, one of the things that we do is we go, and as you can see, we have access to just a huge number of breach packages, but you can also see, just based on the number of dots in that top graph, just the massive explosion in breach packages that are available. We've gone in and actually, through the process of deduplication, pulling out all of these username and password combinations, and through the process of deduplication, we've seen roughly a 20x increase in the last year of unique, and I'll stress that, unique username and password combinations that are available in underground forums that are actively being traded and sold. And roughly just a year ago, we had about 100 million unique username and password combinations. We've just gone over the 2 billion mark. And this is an example of where, and this is a service that we provide to our customers, where our analysts, through their threat research, right, and through their investigations, are able to curate the pieces of information that the bad guys are using in order to, exploit organizations. And I would argue that using compromised credentials is increasingly taking the place of exploiting known vulnerabilities as a way to go and exploit an organization, get into it, and move laterally. We are able to see this tremendous number of usernames and password combinations and then provide a service to our customers. So, hey, for example, large bank XYZ, we happen to see a new breach package that showed up in an underground forum yesterday. And this gets back to your notion of timely intelligence. And this is a true story, right? And it has 50 of your employees' email addresses and passwords in that breach package. We alert our customers. We tell them exactly whose employees, what employee credentials have been compromised. And let me stress here, we don't share information from one customer with another customer. We keep this information very segmented to only the concerning parties, but we alert them immediately that they have employees whose credentials have been compromised. They're floating around in an underground forum. They are available for use today by a bad guy if a bad guy wanted to use them and got a hold of them. And working with that organization, they are able to then go in there and immediately either reset passwords or shut down access for anybody using those credentials in order to protect those organizations. So this is a case where the ability to kind of comb multiple sources in this huge surface area of potential sources of information, curate that information, aggregate it, distill it down, deduplicate it, and then turn it into something that is relevant to a specific organization in a timely fashion, i.e. the definition of threat intelligence, can be used to protect an organization from unauthorized access to digital assets.
Yeah, A.J., I'm glad you mentioned the growth in the threat or the available breach packages, because that was a big theme at Black Hat, and I don't think most people understand the commercialization of this. I mean, you've got state actors, you've got cyber criminals, but there's this whole kind of underground, growing, booming economy to service those groups.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. I mean, look, the numbers here speak for themselves. It really is staggering. Just the number of breach packages that are floating around, as well as just the sheer scale of unique credentials that are available, today in order to exploit an organization. Yeah.
So that brings us to our next question. How can threat intelligence close covert channels and protocol-specific infrastructure like DNS? And DNS was also a big topic at Black Hat, where I talked to Dan Kaminsky, and he, who's a well-known security researcher, and he talked about the fact that the DNS infrastructure is still pretty insecure. So how do we improve that, or how do we address that with threat intelligence?
Yeah, so and I'll go one step further. It's interesting. So, for those who know DNS, and maybe for those who don't, one of the challenges with DNS is that, it's the first thing that anytime you type in an address into a web browser, or any IoT device, like you said, is trying to get to a specific domain, the first thing it's going to do is try to resolve that domain, which means that DNS always has to respond, right? It's an open port, right? In order for it to work effectively, it always needs to be open. Another thing, not only, and Dan, I've read, for a number of years, just his thoughts on DNS, and he's spot on. It's timely. A well-known threat, actually two well-known threat research labs just recently came out, tracking a new threat actor called Project Sauron or Strider, depending on which research lab you're talking about. They called out specifically that the sophistication of that actor, in addition to doing a whole bunch of other things to help it avoid detection, made extensive use of the DNS protocol for data exfiltration and real-time status reporting. Right? Now, this is interesting because DNS, like I said, always has to respond. We have pieces of threat intelligence, from malware and other indicators of compromise that we know from a timeliness perspective. There are domains associated with domain generation algorithms that an infected device is going to try to contact over the DNS channel. And in many cases, it will use that channel to exfiltrate the data. And those devices will actually never hit the other parts of the network where the existing security controls are at, right? Because it goes out over DNS. It's not necessarily going to hit your firewall, or it's not going to hit your web proxy. It may never hit your web proxy because it hasn't, resolved that DNS back to the IP address to go out that part of the network. So by taking these indicators of compromise, specifically domains from domain generation algorithms or other pieces of information, and again, I'll go back to the earlier example that I gave where the incident responder can use their NetFlow traffic to make a determination about what IP address on the global internet their internal devices are talking to. The way that we then take threat intelligence to get more context about that IP address is by correlating the passive DNS information with that IP address. So now all of a sudden I have a whole bunch of domains, maybe domains associated with a content delivery network that are being used at a bulletproof hosting service, a whole bunch of domains associated with an IP address, or a whole bunch of domains associated with a domain generation algorithm, where compromised devices are going to try to communicate with those domains over the DNS channel by going through your recursive DNS servers and never hit that part of the network. By being able to tag those domains, if you will, and feed them into a threat intelligence platform, being able to interact with that information, being able to enrich the information, conduct my analysis for incident response or other purposes, we can then feed those domains seamlessly just by, in the case of some of our products, and we have a DNS protocol specific firewall that sits in front of recursive servers, does things like load balancing and all of those things. But through the integration with threat intelligence, we're able to tag domains, feed those out to our DNS firewalls specifically, and intercept those very early stage or initial DNS resolution requests so that that compromised device can't actually ever go and even contact its command and control server, which does two things. One, it never tells the command and control server that it's awake, right? So it can't start receiving tasking information. And two, we're able to log that, and so we're able to see, hey, all of a sudden we have a device on our network that's trying to, contact a known bad location. We've blocked the communication either by redirecting it to an internal sinkhole or just outright dropped the resolution request. And now we can also use that to then determine, okay, what other devices has that internal device been talking to, going back to the incident response use case, and start to quarantine those devices and get out in front of the cleanup effort while still also making sure that they are not able to communicate outside of their network over channels that traditionally have been left open and unprotected like DNS and other channels, with the understanding that those compromised devices may never hit our traditional security controls like our firewalls or our web proxies.
Yeah, what's nice about what you just described, AJ, is it really aligns with my slide where I talked about the top threat intelligence objectives. The number one objective, as you may recall, was improve automated incident prevention, and that's exactly what you're doing here. So I've not only improved prevention, improved my defense, but I've taken people out of the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for making that tie back. I remembered I had at the top of my mind that I wanted to make that tie back to your early slide, and I didn't, so thank you for catching that.
My pleasure. And so the final question, well, how can threat intelligence increase the effectiveness of your existing security infrastructure? And that's a great question because too often when we hear from the industry, it sounds like what they're saying is you need to rip and replace, and no one can do that for financial reasons or just based on their best practices that they've established. So how do we do that?
Yeah, so this is look, this is a bit motherhood and apple pie, and I don't think anybody would argue with these points. The one that you just made and the one that I'll echo is that, and I made earlier, threat intelligence and the different solutions have to integrate with the existing security controls, right? And it really needs to be viewed as a way to augment the existing security controls because, to your point, nobody can afford to rip and replace technology. And let's call out, the gorilla in the room also, or the elephant in the room, depending on what analogy you want to use. The fact of the matter is that people have put their jobs and their expertise on the line, banging the table for investment in certain security controls, and to expect that they're going to immediately turn around and say, well, I was wrong and I need to pull those security controls out, is just not realistic. The responsibility is on us as threat intelligence practitioners to make the investments in the people, processes, and technology more efficient, right? And really, at LookingGlass, that's everything that we strive to do is, how do we integrate with existing security controls, whether it's a SIEM, like a Splunk or an ArcSight, and you can see screenshots here. We integrate, through our API, or how can we integrate with the sharing communities, to your point, whether it's support for standards like STIX and TAXI, or whether it's, support for other standards. The fact of the matter is how you integrate and your ability to integrate is critically important, right? Because at the end of the day, disjointed, siloed solutions have proven not to work, and threat intelligence in and of itself cannot be another disjointed siloed solution. It is not a silver bullet. But I think as we've seen, through this presentation, through your research, and through some of the use cases and workflows, threat intelligence, when used and integrated into existing security controls, whether it's the incident response process and the tools that are used to help facilitate incident response, or whether it's the brand monitoring process, or whether it's your traditional firewalls or your kind of protocol specific firewalls, threat intelligence, when integrated, and it absolutely has to be integrated, and again, through the APIs, through sharing mechanisms, when integrated, it can really sharpen the spear of all of those existing security controls. If businesses are out there, if organizations are out there not talking about how they integrate, and more importantly, not backing up the talk with very specific proof points, whether it's Splunk apps. I mean, look, let's face it, there are products out there that have become the focal point and the single pane of glass, if you will, for all of the operations, all the security operations and other types of operations that are going on in an organization, right? To expect that we're going to go in there and replace those panes of glass with a different pane of glass and have to retrain all of those people is just not realistic. But to go in there and say, here's how we can augment those workflows and train those people, and in some cases, right, it doesn't make sense to take tens of millions or hundreds of millions of indicators and pump them into your SIEM, right? But integrating a threat intelligence platform with your SIEM and giving the analyst a way to enrich the data and interact with the data and really distill the subset of information that they want to then come out of the threat intelligence platform in order to augment their SIEM is a real-world example or use case of how the integration with existing security controls can really increase the effectiveness and improve the efficiency of both the people and the processes, as well as the technology.
I couldn't agree more, and I also think it's important to view threat intelligence as a hub and spoke model. So the hub is the threat intelligence. The spokes can be lots of different tools for analytics, for policy enforcement, for remediation and risk management. And if you have that hub and spokes model, then you can integrate with your existing infrastructure. You can also figure out if you need additional layers of defense. So for instance, your DNS firewall may be an additional layer of defense that either enhances protection or helps you streamline operations.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, you cannot have that hub and spoke model without published APIs that adhere to well-known standards for how you share information. And both of those things are near and dear to our heart here, because at the end of the day, we really are focused on integrating with that infrastructure in order to drive those improvements in efficiencies of people, processes, and technology.
Absolutely. So the bigger truth, this is my last slide, and then I'll turn it back over to A.J., and A.J., feel free to comment after I'm done, but we talked about the need for an aggressive threat intelligence plan, And we do see that enterprises are moving are investing in threat intelligence programs, but they're immature and there are lots of threat intelligence challenges. So then we talked about the need for a strategy to operationalize threat intelligence by winnowing down the number of threat intelligence feeds, by looking for quality metrics of the threat intelligence and how it fits individual organizations' needs, by looking at workflows and sort of an end-to-end methodology in threat intelligence, and by looking at the outputs. So how can threat intelligence improve prevention, detection, and response, integration associated with that? And I've got this three-word kind of finish of centralize, contextualize, and optimize. That kind of sums up what we talked about in 3 words, but it's really about getting more value out of threat intelligence and figuring out where to start with that, because it's important not to boil the ocean, but to pick the right place to start where you can get value and then go from there.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. And I want to just to echo what you said, right? I think the way we look at threat intelligence also is kind of distilling it down into a similar set of 3 words, right? Which is get the data, trust the data, and then be able to act on the data. And I think we've gone through a couple workflows and a couple use cases here. Certainly I want to thank you for your time and your perspective and your expertise. I always enjoy talking to you, Jon. You're a wealth of information. What I would say is that for anybody who is interested in kind of learning more about maybe how we approach the problem and really how we try to integrate with existing security controls, as well as match the maturity of your organization and really craft customized solutions that can match exactly what it is you're trying to do and deal with your pain points. Certainly feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email, contact me, or just come to LookingGlassCyber.com and we would be more than happy to kind of share our perspectives with you.
Great, thanks. And it appears like we have a couple of questions from the audience, AJ, and I think we have time to answer a few. So I'll read them. I'll give you a quick response, and then please jump in. The first question was, there's been recent news that threats are getting easier to address. Is that what you were seeing? So I would say that there are certain threats that are getting easier because we have access to threat intelligence and we've got some improved innovation. But I would say that those are the exceptions, not the rule. In fact, many threats are extremely unique. They're only seen once. The average command and control server, for example, is online for less than 8 hours. So the bad guys know what they're doing. They're moving around. So while some threats may be easier to see, I'd say targeted threats are becoming more difficult to see. And so threat intelligence as a culmination, or being really a more comprehensive view of what's going on in the wild, is more important than it ever was. AJ, comment?
Yes, I would wholeheartly agree with you. I think, look, the script kiddies and kind of the easy stuff, yeah, sure, that, we're doing a good job of closing vulnerabilities in applications and doing more static analysis and all of those things, right? And that's all good. And it's certainly helping to, address, kind of the low-hanging fruit. But the fact of the matter is, the rapidity of change in tactics, techniques, and procedures of bad guys is only continuing to increase, to your point. And the sophistication of those bad guys is only continuing to increase. And, the byproduct of that is that threats in and of themselves are getting increasingly difficult to deal with if you are not essentially monitoring and sitting in the same locations as those bad guys and curating all of the different pieces of threat intelligence in a very timely fashion and being able to apply context to it that is relevant to a specific organization in a time frame that they can actually take action on with the information that they need in order to be able to take action. And so I think in general, threats are getting harder to address, but I think we are coming up with ways and game plans and approaches to be able to, through the use of threat intelligence and other technologies to be able to address those in the time frame that they need to be addressed in order to materially reduce the risk to an organization.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think we're about at time.
Yeah, I think we are. So thanks everyone for listening, and appreciate it. Get back to us with your feedback.